42 years old. In the harsh frontier of 1885, Montana, a woman of 42 wasn't just considered middle-aged, she was considered finished. Helena Vance looked in the mirror and saw a ghost, a widow whose heart had turned as hard as the dry earth of her failing ranch. She had convinced herself that passion was a luxury for the young and the foolish. She was ready to die alone on her land. But she was wrong. Fate was riding up her driveway on a black stallion, carrying a secret that would burn her world to the ground and build it back up again. This is the story of a love that arrived late, struck hard, and proved that the heart never truly retires. The wind howling through the valley of Silver Creek didn't just carry the scent of coming snow, it carried the stench of desperation. Helena Vance stood on the porch of the Whispering Pines ranch, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough-hewn railing. She pulled her late husband's duster coat tighter around her frame. It swallowed her, a constant reminder of the man who had died 3 years ago, leaving her with a mountain of debt and a herd of cattle that seemed to shrink by the week. She caught her reflection in the darkened window pane. A strand of silver hair had escaped her bun, cutting across her temple like a scar. Old, she thought bitterly. Just an old woman protecting a patch of dirt that nobody wants except the buzzards. "Mrs. Vance!" The shout came from the dusty road. Helena didn't flinch. She watched as a buggy rattled up the drive, the wheels kicking up clouds of red dust. It was Mayor Jedediah Holt. He was a man who resembled a bullfrog, in a suit wide, sweaty, and always ready to snap up anything that landed too close. Holt climbed down, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief that cost more than Helena's entire yearly grain supply. "Jedediah," Helena said, her voice flat. "If you're here about the water rights again, turn that buggy around." "My answer hasn't changed." Holt chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Now, Helena, there's no need to be prickly. I'm here as a friend. The bank in Helena is getting impatient. The note is due in 3 months. If you sell the lower pasture to me now, I can make that debt disappear. You can move into town. Get a nice little room at the boarding house. Live out your twilight years in comfort." Twilight years. The words felt like a slap. "My husband is buried on that lower pasture, Jedediah. I'm not selling his grave to you so you can run a railroad spur through it." Holt's smile vanished. His eyes, usually masked by false joviality, turned cold. "You're a stubborn woman, Helena. But winter is coming. You've got no hands to work the herd. You've got a barn roof that leaks and fences that are rotting. You can't hold this place alone. Nature and the bank will take it. I'm just trying to be the merciful option." "Get off my land," she whispered, her hand drifting toward the shotgun, leaning against the doorframe. Holt tipped his hat, mocking her. "Have it your way. But when the snows are 10 feet deep and you're freezing in the dark, don't say I didn't warn you." He rode off, leaving Helena shaking. Not from fear, but from the exhausting, bone-deep truth of his words. He was right. She was alone. She couldn't fix the fences. She couldn't brand the calves. She was 42. Her back ached when it rained, and her hands were rougher than sandpaper. She turned to go inside, resigned to another night of counting pennies by lamplight, when a silhouette on the horizon caught her eye. It was a rider. He wasn't riding a buggy like Holt. He was on horseback, sitting tall and easy in the saddle, moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. Helena watched him approach. Strangers didn't come to Whispering Pines. The road ended here. The rider stopped 10 yards from the porch. The horse was a massive black quarter horse, caked in mud, but well muscled. The man swung down. He was tall, wearing faded denim, and a shirt that had been washed so many times it was almost white. His hat was pulled low, shading his eyes, but she could see the heavy stubble on his jaw, and a thin, jagged scar running from his ear down to his neck. He looked dangerous. But in the Wild West, everyone was dangerous. It was the quiet ones you had to watch. "Lost?" Elara asked, keeping her hand near the shotgun. The man looked up. His eyes were a piercing, startling blue, the color of a glacial lake. They crinkled at the corners, suggesting he used to smile a lot, though he wasn't smiling now. "Not lost, ma'am." His voice was a deep rumble like thunder over the mountains. "Just traveled a long way. This is private property." "I see that. I also see a fence line on the east ridge that's down, and a barn door hanging off its hinges." He took off his hat, revealing thick dark hair, heavily salted with grey. He wasn't a young boy looking for adventure. He was a man seasoned and weathered. He looked to be about her age, maybe older. "I'm looking for work," he said simply. Elara laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You and every drifter in Montana. I can't pay you. I can barely feed myself." "I didn't ask for money," the man said. He stepped closer, and for the first time, Elara felt a strange jolt in her chest, a flutter she hadn't felt in 15 years. It annoyed her. "I'll work for room and board, just a place to lay my head and a hot meal at sundown. I can fix that fence in 2 days, the barn roof in 3. Elara narrowed her eyes. Why? Why would a man work for free? He looked past her toward the rolling hills where the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. A shadow passed over his face, a look of profound grief that Elara recognized instantly, because she saw it in the mirror every morning. "Because I'm tired of moving," he said softly. "And this place, it looks like it needs someone who won't quit on it." He looked back at her, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "The name is Sluss," he said. "Sluss Thorn." Elara hesitated. Her mind screamed danger. A man like this, with scars and no demand for coin, was running from something. The law. A woman passed. But then she looked at the rotting barn door. She looked at the darkening sky. "The bunkhouse is out back," she said, her voice steadying. "It's full of spiders and the stove smokes. Dinner is at 6. If you're late, you don't eat. And Silas." He paused, his hand on his horse's rein. "Ma'am, if I catch you stealing so much as a spoon, I'll shoot you where you stand." Silas Thorne tipped his hat. For a fleeting second, a genuine warm smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt it, ma'am." As he led his horse toward the barn, Elara watched him. She told herself she hired him out of necessity. She told herself he was just a hired hand. But as she walked into her empty, silent house, the air felt different. Charged. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the only living soul on Whispering Pines, and deep down she was terrified of what that might mean. 3 weeks passed, and the transformation of Whispering Pines was nothing short of miraculous. Silas Thorne was a man of his word, and then some. He worked with a relentless, quiet fury. He didn't just fix the east fence, he reinforced the posts with rock piles so they'd withstand the spring floods. He didn't just rehang the barn door, he oiled the tracks and fixed the loft ladder while he was at it. He spoke little. At dinner, he would sit at the far end of the long oak table, eating the stew Elara prepared with polite efficiency. He never complained about the lack of meat or the stale bread. Elara found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. She watched the way the muscles in his back moved when he chopped wood, the easy grace with which he handled the horses. He had a way with the animals that was almost supernatural. Even Rusty, the temperamental stallion that had thrown her late husband, followed Silas around like a puppy. It was infuriating. And it was intoxicating. One Tuesday evening, a biting chill settled over the ranch. Elara was in the kitchen kneading dough, her hands aching from the cold. The back door opened, bringing in a gust of wind, and Silas. He was carrying a crate of supplies he'd fetched from town supplies he had bartered for using some old scrap metal he'd found in the shed. "Put it on the counter," she said, not looking up. "You're favoring your left shoulder," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Elara froze. "I'm fine." "You wince every time you push the dough. It's the weather. The low pressure gets into the joints." He walked over, placing the crate down. He was close now. She could smell him pine sweat and tobacco. It was a masculine, earthy scent that suddenly made the large kitchen feel very small. "I have some liniment in my saddlebag," he said. "Made from arnica and cayenne. Helps with the ache." "I don't need your charity, Mr. Thorne. I'm not an invalid. I'm just—" She trailed off, frustrated. "Just doing everything yourself," he finished for her. His voice was gentle, lacking the mockery she expected from men. "Elara, there's no shame in hurtin'. We ain't as young as we used to be. The miles count double now." It was the first time he had used her first name. It hung in the air, intimate and unauthorized. She turned to scold him, to remind him of his place, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't looking at her like a boss or an old woman. He was looking at her. He was looking at the woman beneath the grey hair and the widow's weeds. "Why are you really here, Silas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You work like a demon. You fixed the corral in a day. You know where the tools are kept before I even tell you. Last week I saw you checking the foundation of the house. You knew exactly where the loose stone was. The one my husband Thomas meant to fix for years." Silas stiffened. The warmth left his eyes replaced by a guarded veil. He turned away, taking his hat off and running a hand through his hair. "Buildings are built the same way, mostly," he muttered. "Don't lie to me." She stepped closer. "Who are you? Did you know Thomas?" Silas turned back, his jaw tight. "I knew of him. Everyone in the territory knew Thomas Vance. He was a good man. He was a gambler and a dreamer," Elara corrected sharply, "and he left me with nothing but this land and his debts, so don't eulogize him to me." Silas looked at her, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her, or kiss her. The tension was so thick it was suffocating. "He left you this land," Silas said intensely, "and this land is worth fighting for. That's why I'm here, because I hate seeing good things go to waste, or good people." Before Elara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the yard. Not one horse many. Elara rushed to the window. "It's Holt, and he's brought the sheriff." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She wiped her floury hands on her apron and grabbed the shotgun from the corner. Silas was already moving his hand, hovering near the Colt revolver he wore on his hip, a gun she had never seen him draw, but which he wore as naturally as a limb. They stepped onto the porch together. Mayor Holt was there alongside Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies. But there was another man with them, a slim man with wire-rimmed glasses, holding a sheaf of papers. "Evening, Elara," Holt shouted. His face flushed with woo victory. "Put the gun down, darling. We're here on official business." "I told you to stay away, Holt," Elara shouted back. "And I told you I'd save you from yourself," Holt sneered. He gestured to the man with the glasses. "This here is Mr. Perkins from the Helena Bank. Seems there was a clause in your husband's loan agreement. A failure to maintain clause. If the property value dips below the loan amount due to negligence, the bank can foreclose immediately. We're here to inspect the property and seize it." "Negligence?" Elara gasped. "The ranch is in better shape than it's been in years." "Is it?" Holt smirked. "Sheriff, check the south barn. I hear it's a fire hazard." Elara knew immediately what was happening. They were going to plant something, or break something. It was a setup. "You step foot in that barn, and I'll—" Elara raised the shotgun. "Drop it, Mrs. Vance!" the sheriff barked, drawing his weapon. Suddenly, Silas stepped in front of Elara. He moved with a speed that blurred the eye. In a heartbeat, his revolver was in his hand, hammered back, leveled directly at Mayor Holt's chest. The clearing went dead silent. "You're not inspecting anything tonight," Silas said. His voice wasn't a rumble anymore. It was the hiss of a rattlesnake. "This is private land, and unless you have a court order signed by a judge, you're trespassing. And in Montana, trespassing is a capital offense." Holt's eyes went wide. He looked at Silas, really looked at him for the first time. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the foreman of this ranch," Silas lied smoothly. "And I can testify that the property value has increased by 20% in the last month. So your clause is void." He took a step forward, the gun not wavering a millimeter. "Now take your paid-off sheriff and your banker, and get off this land, before I confuse you for a coyote." Sheriff Miller looked at Silas, noting the stance, the grip, the cold deadness in the eyes. Miller was a bully, not a warrior. He recognized a killer when he saw one. "Let's go, Mr. Mayor," Miller mumbled, holstering his gun. "We can get the judge's signature tomorrow if you want. No need for bloodshed tonight." Holt turned purple with rage. "This isn't over, Elara. You think hiring a gunman will save you? I'll bury you both." As the dust settled from their retreat, Elara found she was trembling violently. The adrenaline was crashing. She looked at Silas. He was slowly holstering his gun, his face pale. "You could have gotten us killed," she whispered. "I bought us time," Silas said. He turned to face her, and the hardness melted away. He reached out his rough hand, hesitating before gently covering her trembling hand that still gripped the shotgun barrel. "I won't let them take this place, Elara. I promise you." "Why?" she demanded, tears of frustration and fear finally spilling over. "Why do you care so much? You're just a stranger." Silas looked down at her, his blue eyes agonizingly sad. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn, leather-bound pocket watch. He clicked it open and held it out to her. Elara looked. Inside the watch wasn't a clock face. It was a miniature daguerreotype portrait. It was a picture of a young woman, laughing, sitting on a fence. It was Elara. But it was Elara from 20 years ago, before she had ever met Thomas Vance. "I'm not a stranger, Elara," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm the man who watched you from across the dance hall in Abilene 22 years ago. I'm the man who was too poor, too rough, and too scared to ask you to dance. I let Thomas step in. I let him take the life I should have fought for. I've spent 20 years regretting that one moment of cowardice." Elara stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. "I didn't come here for a job," Silas said, stepping closer, the heat of his body radiating against hers in the cold night air. "I came here because I heard you were in trouble, and I swore that if I ever got a second chance, I wouldn't wait on the sidelines." Elara couldn't breathe. The wind howled around them, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, a heart she thought had stopped beating years ago. The snow began falling an hour after Mayor Holt's buggy disappeared down the track, slow fat flakes that spiraled lazily out of a leaden sky. But within 2 hours, the laziness was gone. The wind picked up screaming down from the Rockies with a banshee wail that rattled the window panes in their frames. It was a widowmaker storm, the kind that buried landmarks and froze cattle where they stood. Inside the farmhouse, the silence between Elara and Silas was heavier than the storm outside. The pocket watch lay open on the kitchen table between them. The face of the young girl, Elara at 20, smiled up at the ceiling, frozen in a moment of joy that the woman of 42 could barely remember feeling. Elara sat at the head of the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She didn't look at Silas. She looked at her own hands, reddened by work knuckles, slightly swollen skin, papery near the wrists. She compared them to the smooth, pale hands of the girl in the picture. "You kept it," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, nearly lost under the roar of the wind battering the clapboard siding. "For 22 years. Why?" Silas was standing by the stove, feeding splits of pine into the firebox. The orange glow illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the grey at his temples, the weariness that seemed etched into his very bones. He didn't turn around immediately. He poked the fire, watching the sparks fly up the flue. Because it was the only proof I had that I could feel something, he said, low and rough. He turned, leaning his hip against the warm iron of the stove. After the war, I was hollowed out, Elara. I saw things at Antietam that burned the soul right out of me. I drifted west because I didn't fit in civilized places anymore. I was a husk, just walking, working, drinking. He took a slow breath, his blue eyes locking onto hers across the dim room. Then I walked into that dance hall in Abilene. The air was thick with smoke and cheap perfume and sweat. And there you were. You were sitting on that rail laughing at something your friend said. And for the first time in 3 years, the noise in my head stopped. Elara felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. I was a foolish girl then. I thought the world was waiting for me to unwrap it like a present. You were light, Silas corrected her softly. You were pure light, and I was darkness. I had dirt under my fingernails and blood on my conscience. I watched Thomas Vance walk up to you. He was clean-shaven. He wore a suit. He looked like a future. I looked like a past you'd want to forget. Thomas gave me a hard life, Silas, Elara said bitterly. He gambled away my dowry. He brought me to this harsh land, and then died, leaving me to fight the wolves alone. I know, Silas said. He walked over to the table and sat opposite her. The wood creaked under his weight. And that is the regret I carry every day. I thought I was doing the noble thing, stepping aside for a better man. But I was just scared. I was scared that if I touched you, I'd stain you. Elara looked up, meeting his gaze. The intensity there was frightening. It wasn't the hungry look of a young suitor. It was the steady, burning devotion of a man who had thought about this moment for decades. I'm not that girl anymore. Silas, she said, her voice trembling. She gestured to her face, to the silver streak in her hair. Look at me. Really look at me. I'm dried up. I'm tired. My back aches when it rains, and I have more worries than I have years left. You waited 20 years for a ghost. Silas reached across the table. His hand, calloused and scarred from years of barbed wire and bronco-busting, covered hers. His skin was rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. I'm not looking for a girl, Elara. I'm a grown man. I've got my own scars. I've got a knee that locks up and a shoulder that clicks. I don't want a giggling girl in a silk dress. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. I want the woman who stood on that porch with a shotgun and told the mayor to go to hell. I want the woman who kept this ranch alive when anyone else would have sold out. I want the steel, Elara, not the silk. The air in the kitchen seemed to vanish. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a sensation so foreign it felt like pain. She wanted to pull her hand away to retreat into the safety of her loneliness. But she couldn't. His warmth was seeping into her thawing places she had thought permanently frozen. Crack! A sound like a gunshot shattered the moment. They both jumped. The wind had torn a shutter loose on the second floor. It banged violently against the siding, threatening to shatter the glass. The storm, Silas said, the spell breaking. He stood up instantly, the practical foreman taking over. If that shutter breaks the window, the snow will get in and rot the floorboards. I need to fix it. You can't go out there, Elara protested, standing up. It's a whiteout. I'll be quick, but I need you to hold the lamp at the window so I can see the latch. The next hour was a chaotic battle against nature. The romance of the kitchen was replaced by the brutal reality of the frontier. Elara stood in the upstairs bedroom, the wind screaming through the glass, holding the kerosene lamp high. Outside, she could see Silas clinging to the icy siding of the house, his coat whipping around him, hammering the shutter back into place. When he finally climbed back through the kitchen door, he was covered in snow. His lips blue, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Get those wet clothes off," Elara ordered, her maternal instinct overriding her hesitation. "You'll catch pneumonia." She stoked the fire until the stove was roaring. She found an old wool blanket, one of Thomas's, and handed it to him. Silas stripped off his freezing coat and sodden shirt, turning his back to her out of modesty. Elara couldn't help but look. His back was a map of violence. There were old scars, puckered and white, likely from the war. There were newer ones, scratches from the brush. It was a body that had been used hard by life. It wasn't perfect, but it was powerful. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and sat close to the stove, shivering. Elara heated up a pot of broth and poured a generous amount of whiskey into it. She handed it to him. Their fingers brushed. "Thank you," he chattered. "You're a fool for going out on that roof," she scolded gently. "I told you." Silas looked up, the color slowly returning to his face. "I'm done letting things fall apart." They sat in the kitchen as the storm raged through the night. The separation of employer and hand had dissolved. They were just two people trapped in a wooden box in a sea of white. Around midnight, the temperature in the house dropped as the drafts worked their way in. "The bunkhouse stove is small," Silas murmured, looking toward the door. "It'll be out by now. It'll be freezing in there." Elara hesitated. Propriety dictated she send him out to the freezing bunkhouse. But humanity and something else dictated otherwise. "You can't sleep out there tonight, Silas. You'll freeze to death." She looked at the rug in front of the large hearth in the living room. "Take the cushions from the sofa. Sleep by the fire here. I'll go upstairs." Silas looked at her, gratitude washing over his face. "Thank you, Elara." Elara went upstairs to her cold, empty bed. She lay under 3 quilts, listening to the wind and the occasional pop of the fire downstairs. She knew a man who claimed to love her, was sleeping just beneath her. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel big and empty. It felt full. She closed her eyes, and instead of worrying about the bank or the herd, she drifted to sleep, wondering what it would feel like to not be the one who had to be strong all the time. The morning broke with a deceptive peace. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under 3 feet of brilliant, blinding white snow. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. Elara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She sat up confused. She hadn't made bacon. She threw on her heavy robe and hurried downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen, fully dressed in his dry clothes. He had shaved. The stubble was gone, revealing a strong, square jawline that made him look 10 years younger. He was moving around her kitchen with an ease that suggested he had been there for years, not weeks. "Morning," he said, not turning from the skillet. "Found a slab of bacon in the pantry. Hope you don't mind. Figure we'll need the grease to get through the snowdrifts to the barn." Elara smoothed her hair, suddenly self-conscious of her morning appearance. You didn't have to cook." "You looked tired last night," Silas said. He plated the bacon and eggs. "Sit. Eat." It was domestic. It was simple. And it was terrifyingly comfortable. After breakfast, the reality of the ranch returned. They spent 4 hours digging a path to the barn. The snow was heavy and wet. By the time they reached the barn doors, they were both sweating, despite the freezing air. Inside, the animals were restless but safe. Silas checked the horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones. Elara began tossing hay into the stalls. "We lost a section of the corral fencing," Silas noted, looking out the back window of the barn. "But the herd huddled in the canyon. They look all right." "We got lucky," Elara sighed, leaning on her pitchfork. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Silas said, checking the hooves of the black stallion. "You built good shelters in that canyon. You're a smart rancher, Helena." His praise warmed her more than the coffee had. The day passed in hard, rhythmic labor, but as the sun began to dip low in the west, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the peaceful atmosphere shattered. Helena was in the house preparing a stew when she heard the horses screaming. It wasn't the whinny of hunger or irritation. It was the high-pitched, terrifying shriek of panic. She dropped the ladle and ran to the window. Thick black smoke was billowing out of the hayloft of the main barn. "Silas!" she screamed, though he wasn't in the house. He was out by the woodpile. She saw him drop the axe and sprint toward the barn. Helena didn't think. She reacted. She grabbed her coat and ran out into the snow, slipping and stumbling as she raced toward the inferno. The fire was moving fast. Hay is tinder dry even in winter. The flames were licking up the sides of the wooden structure, fueled by the draft from the open loft doors. When Helena reached the barn doors, the heat hit her like a physical blow. The smoke was acrid and blinding. "Silas!" she screamed again. "Get back!" Silas's voice roared from inside the smoke. She peered in, coughing. Silas was inside the burning structure. He wasn't running out. He was running toward the stalls. He was trying to release the horses. "You'll die in there," Helena cried, grabbing a bucket of water from the trough and throwing it uselessly at the raging flames near the door. "Open the paddock gate," Silas shouted. His voice choked with smoke. "I'm driving them out." Helena scrambled to the side of the barn, her fingers fumbling with the frozen latch of the paddock gate. She kicked it open, just as a stampede erupted. 3 quarter horses burst out of the smoke-filled barn eyes, rolling in terror, manes singed. They galloped into the deep snow, safe. But Silas didn't come out, and Rusty the black stallion hadn't come out. "Silas!" Helena screamed, her heart stopping. The roof groaned. The main support beam was engulfed. She took a step toward the burning doors. She would not lose him. She would not lose another man to this cursed land. Just as she prepared to run into the fire, a dark shape exploded from the smoke. It was Silas mounted bareback on Rusty. He was low over the horse's neck, a handkerchief tied over his face. He urged the terrified stallion through the wall of fire at the doorway. They cleared the threshold just as the hayloft collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the twilight sky. Silas slid off the horse into the snow, coughing violently. He dragged the horse away from the heat, then collapsed on his hands and knees, retching up soot. Helena fell into the snow beside him. She didn't care about the grime. She grabbed his face, her hands shaking. "Silas! Silas, look at me!" His face was blackened with soot. His eyebrows singed, and his shirt had burn holes in the sleeve. But his blue eyes opened watery and red-rimmed. I got 'em all," he wheezed. "All of them." "You idiot!" Helena sobbed, pulling him into her arms, burying her face in his smoky, burnt-smelling neck. "You could have died. Why did you go back for the horse?" Silas leaned his weight against her, his breathing ragged. "Because he's your favorite." They sat there in the snow, watching the barn. The heart of the ranch's operation burned to the ground. The orange glow illuminated the tears tracking through the soot on Helena's face. As the adrenaline faded, a cold realization settled in. Barns don't just catch po in the winter, not when there's no lightning, not when the lanterns weren't lit. Silas seemed to realize it at the same moment. He pulled away from Helena gently and stood up, swaying slightly. He walked toward the edge of the ruin where the fire hadn't yet consumed the snow. He knelt down and picked something up. Helena walked over to him. "What is it?" Silas held it out. It was a kerosene can, a distinct red-painted tin can. "We don't use this brand," Helena whispered, a chill colder than the snow gripping her spine. "We use blue tins from the mercantile." "I know," Silas said. His voice had changed. The warmth, the vulnerability of the previous night was gone. In its place was the cold, deadly tone of the gunman who had faced down the sheriff. He turned the can over. Scratched into the bottom, barely visible in the firelight, were the initials J.H. Jedediah Holt, Silas said. The name sounded like a curse. He tried to burn us out, Elara said, horror dawning on her. He didn't care if the animals died. He didn't care if we died. Silas dropped the can. He turned to Elara. The firelight reflected in his eyes, but it wasn't passion anymore. It was rage. A precise, calculated rage. He thinks you're weak, Elara. He thinks you're an old widow who will cry over the ashes and sign the deed. Silas reached down and took her hand. His grip was iron. He doesn't know he just started a war. Elara looked at the burning remains of her husband's barn. She thought of the banknote. She thought of Holt's oily smile. And then she looked at Silas, this man, who had walked through fire for a horse simply because she loved it. Something inside her snapped. The fear that had ruled her life for 3 years evaporated in the heat of the fire. I don't have a barn anymore, Elara said, her voice hard and clear. So I have nothing left to lose. She looked at Silas. You said you were dangerous once, Silas. You said you had blood on your hands. I did. Good, Elara said, because I need you to teach me. If Holt wants a fight, I'm not going to just defend this land anymore. She squeezed his hand back. I'm going to take him down. For 2 days, Whispering Pines smelled of wet ash and ruin. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood against the white snow like a rotten tooth, a constant silent reminder of how close death had come. But inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere had shifted from fear to a cold, hard resolve. Elara stood in the center of the living room. The furniture had been pushed back. The rug was rolled up. She was wearing a pair of trousers she had found in an old trunk of Thomas's, oversized and cinched tight, with a leather belt and a heavy wool shirt. She looked less like a widow and more like a soldier. Again, Silas said. He stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed. On the table across the room sat 3 empty tin cans. Elara raised the heavy Colt Peacemaker. Her arm trembled under its weight. It was a terrifying machine, smelling of oil and cold steel. She sighted down the barrel, trying to align the notch with the bead, but the metal danced in her vision. You're strangling it. Silas's voice was low, vibrating through the quiet room. He walked over to her, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. He didn't take the gun from her. Instead, he moved behind her. He placed his left hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. His right hand came up to wrap gently around her wrist, over her own white-knuckled grip. Loosen your hand, Elara, he whispered near her ear. His breath ghosted against her neck, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It's not a hammer, you don't force it. It's an extension of your pointing finger. Just point. She exhaled, letting her shoulders drop. Under his guidance, the barrel steadied. Take a breath, Silas instructed. Hold it. Squeeze. Don't pull. Elara squeezed. The hammer fell on an empty chamber click. Good, Silas murmured. You didn't flinch. Most people blink. He stepped back, the loss of his warmth leaving her instantly colder. Thomas never taught me to shoot, she said, lowering the gun. He said it was unladylike. He said he'd always be there to protect me. Thomas was a man of his time, Silas said, walking to the window to scan the horizon. He was always scanning now. But out here, ladylike gets you killed, and protection is just a word until you hold it in your hand. He turned back to her, his face shadowed. Elara, are you sure about this? Once we ride out to find the man who dropped that kerosene can, there is no going back. We are crossing a line. The law calls it vigilantism. Elara looked at the gun in her hand. She thought of the terrified scream of the horses. She thought of Holt's smug, oily face. She thought of the 20 years she had spent being polite, being quiet, being good, only to be left with nothing. "The law is in Holt's pocket, Silas," she said, her voice steady. "If we don't draw the line, who will?" Silas studied her for a long moment, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his eyes. He nodded once. "Then load it. We ride in 10 minutes." They tracked the arsonist not by sight, but by the story the snow told. Silas showed Elara the signs, a broken twig on a pine tree, a smear of tobacco juice on a rock, the deep, floundering hoofprints of a horse pushed too hard in deep drift. The trail led them 5 miles west into the jagged foothills known as Devil's Throat. It was a lawless patch of land, full of box canyons and caves. "Here." Silas stopped his horse, holding up a hand. They dismounted in silence. Silas pointed to a thin wisp of grey smoke rising from a cluster of boulders 100 yards up the slope. "He's camping," Silas whispered, "waiting for the snow to melt so he can ride back to town for his payment." "What do we do?" Elara asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We don't kill him," Silas said, his eyes hard as flint. "Dead men don't testify. We need him to talk. We need him to say Holt's name in front of witnesses." They moved up the slope on foot, the snow muffling their steps. Elara followed Silas, stepping exactly where he stepped. She watched him move, predatory, silent, lethal. It frightened her how good he was at this. It reminded her that the tender man who held her hand in the kitchen was also a weapon forged in war. They reached the camp. A man was sitting by a small fire, roasting a rabbit on a spit. It was Caleb Rourke, a known drifter and hired muscle, a man with a reputation for doing dirty work for cheap coin. Silas signaled Elara to go left. He went right. Elara crouched behind a boulder, the Colt heavy in her hand. She waited for Silas's signal. Suddenly, Rourke's horse whinnied. Rourke spun around, reaching for his rifle, leaning against a rock. "Don't!" Elara shouted, stepping out from cover. She raised the Colt, leveling it at his chest. Her hands were shaking, but she held her ground. Rourke froze. He looked at her, a middle-aged woman in men's pants, and sneered. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well now," Rourke chuckled, his hand inching back toward his rifle. "Mrs. Vance, I heard you were a feisty one. You gonna shoot me, darlin'? You got the stomach for it." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Elara warned, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't think you will," Rourke taunted. "I think you should drop that toy and come over here. Maybe we can negotiate." He lunged for the rifle. Elara squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot went wide, kicking up snow 3 feet to Rourke's left. The recoil jarred her arm to the shoulder. Rourke laughed and grabbed his rifle, swinging it around. But before he could aim, a shadow detached itself from the rocks behind him. Silas was there. He didn't shoot. He struck. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the back of Rourke's head with a sickening crunch. Rourke collapsed face first into the snow, unconscious. Silas stood over him, breathing hard. He looked up at Elara. The gun smoke hung in the freezing air between them. "You missed," Silas said softly. Elara stared at the gun, terrified by the power she had just unleashed. "I hesitated." Silas walked over to her. He took the gun from her trembling fingers and holstered it. Then he took her face in his hands. "You missed because you're not a killer, Elara," he said fiercely. "And thank God for that. Don't ever apologize for having a soul." He pulled her into a hug, holding her tight against his chest as the adrenaline crashed out of her. "Now," Silas said, looking down at the unconscious man. "Let's wake him up. We have a delivery to make." The town of Silver Creek was quiet under the midday winter sun, but it was a tense quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The double doors of the Silver Creek Saloon swung open. Every head turned. The piano player stopped mid-chord. The bartender froze with a rag in a glass. Silas Thorne walked in first. He looked like a nightmare walked out of the history books. He was unshaven, dark-eyed, and radiated a dangerous calm. He dragged a man behind him, Caleb Rourke, whose hands were bound with rope and whose face was a bruised map of regret. Behind them walked Elara Vance. She held her head high, her eyes sweeping the room with a cold majesty that made the patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Silas threw Rourke onto the floor in the center of the room. Rourke groaned, spitting blood. "Whiskey," Silas said to the bartender. "For the lady." The room remained deadly silent. At the back table holding court as usual sat Mayor Jedediah Holt. He was playing cards with Sheriff Miller and the banker Mr. Perkins. Holt's face went the color of curdled milk. "What is the meaning of this?" Holt demanded, standing up. "Thorne, isn't it? You can't just drag a man into my establishment like a sack of grain." "This isn't a man," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This is the dog you sent to burn down the Vance barn." Gasps rippled through the saloon. Arson was a despised crime on the frontier. It was a coward's weapon. "Lies," Holt sputtered, looking at the sheriff. "Miller, arrest this man for assault." Sheriff Miller stood up, his hand dropping to his gun. "Now, Silas, you let Caleb go. You're making a mistake." "The only mistake," Elara stepped forward, her voice ringing clear and authoritative, "was thinking you could bully me into silence, Jedediah." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the red kerosene tin. She slammed it onto the table in front of Mr. Perkins, the banker. "This can was found in the ashes of my barn," Elara declared. "It has the mayor's initials scratched into the bottom, and we have the man who poured it." She looked down at Rourke. Silas took a step toward the prisoner, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Tell them, Caleb," Silas said. "Tell Mr. Perkins who paid you $50 to light that match, or I hand you over to the ranchers in this room who lost winter feed because of fires like that." Rourke looked at Silas, then at the angry murmurs of the crowd. He looked at Holt, who was sweating profusely. "It was Holt!" Rourke shouted, desperate to save his own skin. "He paid me. He said he needed the Vance place cheap for the railroad, right of way. He said if the barn burned, the bank would foreclose." The room erupted. Mr. Perkins, the man with the wire-rimmed glasses, stood up slowly. He looked at the kerosene can, then at Holt. "Is this true, Mayor?" Perkins asked, his voice icy. "The bank does not look kindly on fraud or arson. If you destroyed collateral to force a foreclosure, that is a federal crime." Holt was cornered. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped rat. He saw the disgust on the faces of the townspeople. He saw his political career evaporating. "I did what I had to do for the progress of this town." Holt screamed, his veneer of civility shattering. "She's just a stubborn old woman blocking the future. The railroad needs that land." "So you admit it," Elara said softly. Holt's face twisted into a mask of pure hate. "You think you've won, Elara? You think this drifter can save you?" Holt's hand flashed under his coat. He pulled a Derringer, a hideout gun. "Look out!" Silas roared. Time seemed to slow down. Silas didn't draw his gun. He was too far away, and Holt was aiming at Elara. Instead, Silas threw himself in front of her. Crack! The small pistol fired. Silas jerked back, hitting Elara, knocking them both to the floor. "No!" Elara screamed. Before Holt could cock the hammer for a second shot, the room exploded into motion. But it wasn't Silas who ended it. It was Sheriff Miller. The sheriff, finally seeing the line he couldn't cross, drew his revolver and pistol-whipped the mayor across the temple. Holt crumbled to the floor, unconscious. The saloon fell into a stunned silence. Elara scrambled out from under Silas. Silas, Silas. He was lying on his back, clutching his left shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, staining his shirt dark crimson. His face was pale, his teeth clenched in pain. "I'm all right," he gritted out, though his voice was strained. "It hit the shoulder, missed the lung." Elara pressed her hands over his wound, tears streaming down her face. "You foolish, foolish man. You jumped in front of a bullet." Silas looked up at her, his blue eyes hazy but focused on her face. He managed a weak, crooked smile. "I told you," he whispered, lifting a bloody hand to touch her cheek. "I've waited my whole life for you. I wasn't about to let it end now." Mr. Perkins knelt beside them. "I'll fetch the doctor. Mrs. Vance, the bank, will suspend all foreclosure proceedings, pending an investigation. Your land is safe." Elara didn't look at the banker. She didn't look at the unconscious mayor being dragged away to the jail cell. She only had eyes for the man bleeding on the floor of the saloon. "I don't care about the land," she sobbed softly. "Just don't you dare die on me, Silas Thorne." "Not a chance." Silas breathed, his eyes fluttering shut as the pain overtook him. "I've got a barn to rebuild." Winter did not leave the valley easily, but when it finally broke, it did so with a riot of wildflowers. The snow melted into the creek, swelling it with clear, cold water, and the brown earth turned a vibrant, impossible green. 3 months had passed since the shooting in the saloon. Elara stood on the porch of Whispering Pines, but it wasn't quiet anymore. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of hammers and the rasp of saws. It wasn't just Silas working. Half the town had come out. Shame is a powerful motivator, and after the truth about Mayor Holt had come out, the people of Silver Creek were eager to make amends. They were raising a new barn, bigger, stronger, and built on a foundation of stone that would last 100 years. Elara wiped her hands on her apron. She walked down the steps carrying a pitcher of lemonade. Silas was sitting on a sawhorse near the frame of the new door, resting. His left arm was still in a sling, a lingering reminder of the bullet he had taken for her, but the color was back in his cheeks. He was watching the men work, barking occasional orders with the natural authority of a man born to lead. He saw her coming, and the hard lines of his face softened instantly. "You're supposed to be resting that shoulder," Elara chided, gently pouring him a glass. "I'm supervising." Silas grinned, taking the glass. His fingers brushed hers, a spark that had become familiar, but never lost its thrill. "Besides, the doctor said I need to keep moving it if I want to saddle a horse by summer." Elara looked at the structure rising against the blue sky. "It's beautiful, Silas. It's better than the old one ever was." "It's built to last," Silas said. He set the glass down and stood up, wincing slightly as his shoulder pulled. He stepped close to her, ignoring the neighbors working nearby. "Like us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I don't have much, Elara," he began, his voice dropping to that deep rumbling register that made her knees weak. "I'm a foreman with a bad shoulder and a past full of ghost. I can't give you youth. I can't give you the years we lost." He opened the pouch. Inside sat a simple ring hammered out of silver, likely made from a coin polished until it shone like moonlight. "But I can give you every sunrise I have left," he said. "I can give you my hands for the work, and my heart for the rest. Mayor Holt called these our twilight years. But looking at you right now, I think he was wrong." Elara looked at the ring, then up at the man who had ridden into her life when she thought her story was over. She saw the grey in his beard and the lines around his eyes, and she thought he was the most handsome thing God had ever created. "He was wrong," Elara whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "It's not twilight, Silas. It's barely noon." She held out her hand, a hand that was calloused strong and no longer shaking. Silas slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Marry me, Elara," he said. "I think I already did," she smiled, "the moment you walked into my kitchen and told me my dough was too cold." He laughed, a sound that rang out across the valley, louder than the hammers. He pulled her in, kissing her deeply right there in front of God and the neighbors and the rolling Montana hills. They weren't young. They weren't perfect. But as they stood there, holding each other up, they were something far more powerful. They were enduring. And that is the legend of Elara Vance and Silas Thorne. Local records in Montana actually show a marriage certificate filed in June of 1886 for the couple, and they say the barn they built together stood for over 80 years before a storm finally took it down. Their story reminds us of a powerful truth. Love doesn't have an expiration date. Society tells us that romance is a game for the young, for the unscarred, for the people who haven't had their hearts broken yet. But Elara and Silas prove that the deepest kind of love is the kind that comes after the heartbreak. It's the love that sees your scars and says, "I have them too." It's the love that arrives late, but just in time. I hope this story touched your heart as much as it did mine. If you believe that it's never too late for a second chance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel share these stories with more people. And I want to know what you think. Do you think Silas should have told Elara who he was from the very beginning, or was he right to wait until he earned her trust? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story from the archives of the Wild West. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your heart open.